Welcome to the complete HTML and CSS course for beginners. Hi, my name is Marius and I'm thrilled to have you here. When I first started learning HTML and CSS, I remember how challenging it could be. That's why I've created this course, so you don't have to go through the same struggle. In this course, you will find more than 20 easy-to-follow lessons, carefully designed to guide you through the basics of HTML and CSS. We'll start with the basics, taking it step by step, and gradually work our way up to more advanced stuff. And as a bonus, we'll wrap up by building a real-world project together. A portfolio website, step by step from scratch. So let's start learning and jump into the first lesson. Hey, welcome to our first lesson on HTML. You want to know how to make websites, right? You are in the perfect spot, because HTML is where it all starts. HTML is like the skeleton of any website. And guess what? We are going to learn it together, step by step. You might be wondering, what is HTML all about? It stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Cool to know, but that info alone isn't enough. First up, HTML is used for structuring web pages. Think of it as the blueprint of a building. And where can we see our HTML code in action? Right, in a web browser like Google Chrome. At its core, HTML is made up of elements. These are the building blocks, like paragraphs, images, and links, that you can piece together to build something great. To sum it up, HTML structures your web pages, is viewable in a browser, and consists of elements. Alright, let's get started and have a look at some HTML code. Here you can see HTML code to the left, and to the right you will see how the code looks when you open it in the browser. It shows a very simple web page with only two elements, a heading and a text paragraph. Now I'm going to show you how to download a code editor. I'm using IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate, but it's a professional tool which costs some money. So I recommend you getting the community version, which is completely free. Another popular and powerful code editor is Visual Studio Code, which is also free to download and use. After you have downloaded your code editor, it's time to open it. First we want to create a file called index.html. The index.html file always serves as the home page of your website. The home page is the first page, which is shown when you open the website in the browser. Remember that every HTML file consists of elements. Now we will have a closer look at how elements work. Most elements consist of two tags, the opening and the closing tag. The element we have just created here is the so-called HTML element, which is the main element of every HTML page. Next, we're gonna have a look at the head element. The head element is used to define metadata of the page. For example, the title of the page. Let's set the title to My Website. As you can see, just as the main element before, the title element has an opening and closing tag too. Let's open the HTML file in the browser now. We just get to see a blank page. That's because we haven't added any content elements to the page yet. But a very interesting thing we already can see is the website's title, which is shown in the browser tab above. Now we will learn the cool stuff, and that's how to add content to our web pages. All of the content elements of a web page are defined within the body element. Let us create the body element just like the other elements before, with an opening and closing tag. Now it's time to add our first content element to our page. It's an H1 heading, which is the main heading of the page. You will learn more about HTML headings in the next lesson of this course. Now it's time to see our code in action and have a look at our newly created heading in the browser. A heading alone is boring, so we're gonna add a text paragraph so our heading isn't lonely anymore. You can create text paragraphs using the P element. When we open the browser again, we will see our heading and the text paragraph. The last thing we are going to learn in this lesson are HTML attributes. Attributes are a way to customize HTML elements. For example, to define the target URL of a link. To create a link element with HTML, we use the A tag. Attributes are defined within the opening tag of elements. To define the target URL of this link, we use the href attribute. Let's point the link to Wikipedia. The text between the opening and closing tag is the label of the link which is shown on the page. Let's set the label to Wikipedia as well. We want to open the browser again and have a look at our link. Now, as you would expect, if we click the link, the browser navigates to Wikipedia. Have you ever visited a website where words are all over the place? Reading websites like this is very tough. The jungle of words will just confuse you 100%. Now, watch this. We've added some headings, made important stuff bold, and added some italics. The text is much better to read now, right? But how do we transform a chaotic text like this into a structured one using HTML? Let's learn it step by step, so after this you will be a text structuring master.
Wow!
Let's dive into the HTML code now. The most basic way to structure text with HTML is using text paragraphs. We can create a text paragraph in HTML by using the p tag. Let's create a little text paragraph and have a look how it will be displayed in the browser. Text paragraphs alone don't make a good structured text, so we will learn now how to use headings and text paragraphs together to structure your texts. Headings in HTML are numbered, starting with H1, which is used for the main heading of every web page. There should only be one H1 heading per page. Then H2 and H3 headings are used for chapters and subchapters. So let's add the H1 heading of the page followed by a text paragraph. We will open the HTML file in the browser now and have a look at the elements we have just created. Next we will add an H2 heading for our first chapter. And again, we will add another text paragraph below the heading. Have a look at our web page in the browser now, it already looks very cool and structured. Chapter 2 will have two subchapters, so we use H3 to add another heading and a text paragraph below it. Now we really can see how headings in HTML work. The higher the number of the heading tag is, the lower the importance of the heading within the page. For example, you can see that H3 headings have a lower text size than H2 and H1 headings. It's time to add the second subchapter of chapter 2. So we just repeat the steps and add another H3 heading followed by a text paragraph. To finish chapter 2, we just create another chapter and call it chapter 3. So we add another H2 heading below the last text paragraph of chapter 2. This chapter won't have subchapters, so we just add a text paragraph below the H2 heading. Great, we've just finished our first web page structured with headings and text paragraphs. Structuring your text with HTML this way will ensure that your users have a great experience when reading your texts. Next up, we will have a look on how to change the appearance of individual parts of text. For example, how to make text bold to highlight its importance. We can make a text bold in HTML using the b tag. Have a look at the browser, and as you can see, the text appears in bold. To make text italic with HTML, we use the I tag. And to make a text appear smaller, we use the small tag, of course. To make a text appear strike through or deleted, we use the del tag. A subscript is a text which appears a little bit below the normal line of the rest of the text. To create subscripts with HTML, we use the sub tag. The opposite of subscripts are superscripts. To create a superscript text, we use the super tag. And finally, to mark a text, just like using a highlighter on paper, we can utilize the mark tag. Until now, we only have created black texts. But what if we want to give our text a fancy color, like red or green? We can use inline CSS to achieve that. CSS is a styling language which is often used together with HTML. With CSS, we have total control over the appearance of our web pages. The style attribute is used to add inline CSS to any HTML element. We want to change the color of this text paragraph to red, so let's add the CSS rule color red. Let's repeat this and add another text paragraph, but this time it will be green. Let's have a look in the browser and we will see we have two text paragraphs, one in red and one in green. The final thing we will learn in this lesson is the so-called pre-tag. Text formatted with the pre-tag will remain all the spaces, line breaks and tabs. To demonstrate this, let us create a text with many spaces and line breaks and then observe it in the browser. As you can see, the format of the text looks exactly the same like in the text editor. Now we want to compare the result of a pre-tag to a normal text paragraph. So we copy and paste the text from the pre-tag to the text paragraph and open our browser again. We will see that the text paragraph will ignore all spaces and line breaks, other than the text formatted with the pre-tag. Okay, now you know the most important things about structuring your text with HTML. Next, we're going to learn everything about hyperlinks in HTML. I'm pretty sure you have already encountered many links throughout your career as an internet user, because links are all over the World Wide Web. Links enable us to jump from website to website and surf the web. Generally speaking, they connect websites with each other. But how can we create links with HTML? Don't worry, we are going to learn it now step by step. To get started, we just create a simple HTML file with a heading on it. Now we are going to add a text paragraph, which will later contain our first link. Remember, we can create text paragraphs in HTML using the p tag. As you can see in the browser to the right, the text paragraph appears. Now it's time to add our first link. In HTML, the A tag is used to create a link. Why A and not L? Easy, because A stands for anchor. Think of it like anchoring another web page to this one. Let's add a link to Wikipedia. So we want to add the A element around the text link to Wikipedia. Have a look at the browser to the right and you will notice the link we have just created. By default, links are displayed underlined and in a different color. If we would click the link now, nothing would happen yet. That's because we haven't defined a target URL so far. The href attribute of the A element is used to define the target URL of the link. Because we want to link to Wikipedia, we set the target URL to wikipedia.org. Now it's time to click the link, and as you can see, it leads us straight to Wikipedia. What if we want the link to open in a new browser tab? This is very easy as well. The only thing we have to do is set the target attribute to _blank. Let's open the web page in the browser again and click on the link. As you can see, Wikipedia opens in a new browser tab. The link we have just created is a so-called external link. External because it links to a web page which is not part of our website. Internal links, on the other hand, connect different web pages of the same website with each other. For example, the navigation menu of a website consists mostly of internal links. So let's create a simple navigation menu for our website now. We will add it on the top of the page before the heading. So create another link using the A tag, but this time we set the href attribute to an internal page of our website. Let's say we want to link an about page, so we set the href attribute to about.html. Dot followed by a slash means that the about page is located in the same folder like our index.html file. We haven't created the about.html file yet, so the link won't work. Let's do this now. Make sure that you create the file in the same folder as the index.html file. An empty file is boring, right? So let us head to our index.html file again and copy all of the content to the about.html file. Now, the title is wrong, of course. We want to change it to About Me. And also delete all the content in the body element. Copy and pasting existing code from your projects can be a powerful tool to save time. But please don't do it mindlessly, as it can lead to lots of duplicated code. Now it's time to add some content to our About Me page. We will start with a heading and a text paragraph below it. Now we have successfully set up everything and are ready to open our index.html file in the browser again. And have a look at our navigation menu. The link to our About Me page appears on top of our homepage. If we click it, the browser opens the page. Next, we're going to learn everything about images, video, and audio in HTML. To be honest, websites with only text aren't very fun to read, because a picture says more than 1,000 words. So it's important to add media to give your users the best possible experience. So let's go and have a look at the code. The first thing we are going to learn is how to add images to your website. We have to create a new directory called Assets, in which we will place all our media files. Pick an image you want to display on your website. I've chosen a photo of a cool cat. Select the image and copy it. Next, go back to your code editor and paste the image to the Assets directory. Now we are ready to display the image with HTML. The img tag is used to display images with HTML. The src or source attribute defines the path of the image file which should be displayed. We want to add the photo of the cat, which we have just copied. So we set the source attribute to /assets/cat.png. If we open the page in the browser now, we notice that the image is very large. Too large to have a good view at the cat. So we are going to set the width of the image to 300 pixels. We can achieve that by using the width attribute of the img element. Cool! Now we are able to see the whole photo. Let's play around a little bit by setting different width values. For example, let's set it to 100 or 10 pixels. As you can see, the photo will appear very small. We can also define the height value independently from the width value. This way, we can change the aspect ratio of the photo. If we set the width to 700 and the height to 100 pixels, the photo will appear very stretched. It's also possible to only define the height and not the width. Let's set the height to 100, for example, and the image will appear with a height of 100 pixels. Now we're going to have a look at the alt attribute. The alt attribute defines a text which should be shown if the image cannot be loaded. Make sure to always define the alt attribute to not confuse your users if your images cannot be loaded. To demonstrate the alt attribute, we change the source attribute to a wrong path, so the image cannot be found and displayed. Next, we're going to define the alt attribute and set the text to a cute cat. And as you can see, the text will appear because the image cannot be loaded. If we correct the source attribute now, the alt text will disappear because the image can be loaded again. HTML can also be used to display videos on your website. To display a video, first we need a video file. If you have a .mov video file, make sure to convert it to MP4 first, because most browsers cannot display .mov videos. Copy and paste the video file to the assets folder now. To add videos with HTML, the video tag is used. So let's add an opening and closing video tag. Within the video element, we have to define a source element. And the source element will have the source attribute, just as the image, which we will use to define the path to the video file. We can define multiple source elements for a single video because the same video can have multiple formats, for example. In our case, we only have one format, MP4, so we define only one single source element and set a type attribute to video/MP4. Let's open the file in the browser now and have a look at our video. Okay, the video is very large, so we have to reduce the width. We can set width and height of videos just as we have done it with the image. We can use the width and height attributes of the video element. So let's set the width to 800 and open the file in the browser again. Now our video appears in a reasonable size. We can also configure our videos to autoplay if we visit the website, so the user doesn't have to click the play button to start the video. To achieve that, we have to add both attributes autoplay and muted to the video tag. And if we open the file in the browser now, we will see that the video just starts playing. The controls attribute is used to hide or show the controls of the video player. Okay, the final thing we are going to learn in this lesson is how to add audio to your website with HTML. First, we need a .mp3 audio file. And we want to copy and paste it to the assets folder again. Audio works similar to video. We have the audio tag and different source elements within it. So let's create an audio element and a source element and pointing to our music file. We set the type to audio/mp3. We add the controls attribute to enable the controls of the audio player. Let's open the web page in the browser and play our music. The next topic we're going to learn in this course is everything about lists and tables in HTML. Both lists and tables are a really good way to structure your texts and data. So we should learn how to use them. But don't worry, it isn't difficult to learn them. So without further talking, let's jump into the code. There are 3 different types of lists in HTML. The first one we're going to have a look at is the so-called unordered list. We create unordered lists with HTML by using the UL tag. The UL element is the container element for each individual list item. We create list items by using the LI tag. Because we want to create a shopping list now, let's create our first list item, eggs. We also want to get cucumber, tomatoes and bread. So let's add them to our shopping list as individual LI elements. Let's open the HTML file in the browser now and have a look at our list. As you can see, each of our list items appears in the list. Because we have created an unordered list, the list items are preceded by a dot. List items of ordered lists, on the other hand, are numbered. Ordered lists work similar to unordered lists. An unordered list consists of the container element. This time it is OL, not UL, and the individual LI elements representing a single list item, just as for the unordered list. This time we want to create a list, including all the steps to do our housework. We have to clean the kitchen, wash dishes, and do the laundry. Let's have a look at our list in the browser now. And as we have just mentioned before, list items of ordered lists are numbered. Because we have 3 different items, we have the numbers 1, 2, 3. But what if you want to create a list consisting of a list item and a description for the list item? Don't worry, HTML also got us covered with this. We can create so-called description lists by using the DL tag. List items of description lists aren't created by using the LI element, but rather we use 2 different tags. The DT element is used to define the title of the list item, and the DD element is used to define the description of the item. Let's create an item HTML, which is the description title, and a suitable description for HTML, which could be, quote, markup language for the web, unquote. Let's add a second item, CSS, which is, of course, the styling language of the web. So let's add this sentence as the description of the item. Now let's have a look at the browser, and we will see the description list looks very different to our ordered and unordered lists. Now we have learned everything about lists. So let's have a look at tables next. To start creating tables with HTML, we have to use the table element. The table element serves as the container element for all of our row and column definitions. Let's create our first row. Rows of tables are created with the TR element. It is the first row of our table, so we want to have headings inside of this row. To create a table heading, we use the TH element. We will create a table listing different electronic products and their prices. So the first heading column will be product, which will contain the name of the product. The second heading column will be price, because our table should contain the product name and the price. Now we have finished our heading row, so let's go to our first data row. Let's create another TR element, but this time we won't use TH to create a column, but we use TD. TD stands for table data. So the first product we want to add to our table is a phone, and the price of the phone will be 500. So our second TD element is 500. Let's check our table in the browser and we will see we have the phone and its price. Most tables come with a cool border. Because borders around cells increase the readability of the table. So we want to have a cool border too. We need to write a little bit of CSS for our border. So we create a style element in the head of our page and add a CSS rule to it. We want a border around the whole table and each TH and each TD element. We want the border to be 1 pixel wide, solid, and black. Let's check out the table in the browser now, and we will see that the border will appear. A table with a single data row is pretty boring, so let's add more items to our table. The second item will be a tablet. So we create another TR element and 2 TD elements within it. The first TD element will be the name again, so we add tablet, and the second TD element will be the price. Let's say our tablet costs 600. And because it was so much fun adding the second item, we will add a third one. This time we want to add a laptop, and we repeat all the steps. First we create a TR element for indicating the row, and the first TD element will be laptop, because it's the name of the product, and the third one, the price again. This time the laptop is a little bit more expensive, so it's 1,500. There are 3 different tags to divide your tables into different sections. The T-head for the table header, the T-body for the main content of the table, and at last the T-foot for the footer of the table. T-head, T-body and T-foot are completely optional and not necessary when you create your tables. Those elements can be used to define specific stylings for each section of the table. For example, if you want to add a specific background color to the footer of your table, or make text in the header of the table bold. Remember, our first row has TH element and not TD elements because we wanted them as headings. So this is our table header. So let's wrap the first table row within a T-head element. The 3 rows showing our products, phone, tablet and laptop, are our table body, so we wrap them in a T-body element. We could use the table footer, for example, to display a sum of all the prices of our products. So let's add another table row with 2 TD elements. The first one will be sum, and the second one, the sum of all prices, which is 2,600. So let's wrap the sum row in a T-foot element. A good table has a caption describing what the table is about. Table captions are created in HTML using the caption element. The caption element should be inside of the table element. Our table shows electronic products and their prices, so let's add a caption for that. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson are column groups. Column groups are a cool way to customize the columns of your table in different ways. For example, we can use column groups to display the last 2 columns with a specific background color to highlight the importance. What we are going to do next is adding a description column to each of our table rows and making it appear in a gray background color. So let's add a third column to our table, description, and add a suitable description for each of our products. Next, we're going to use the col group tag to define column groups. We have 3 different columns in our table, but our column group definition will only have 2 col elements within it. That's because the first 2 columns are one group, product and price, because we don't want to change the appearance of them. The third column, description, we want to display in a gray background color. The span attribute is used to say how many columns this column group will contain. And with the style attribute and a background color CSS rule, we change the background color of the third column to gray. In this lesson, we are going to learn everything about containers in HTML. What are containers in HTML? This or that? Obviously, containers in HTML are not cargo containers on a ship. So let me reveal the secret. The most important container elements in HTML are the div and span containers. Okay, so without any more talking, let's start learning and jump into the code. A container in HTML is a specific HTML element which contains multiple other HTML elements, like in this example where we have a container that contains multiple content elements like paragraphs or images. So let's have a closer look at the div container first. The div container is a so-called block container. Block containers take up the full width of the screen. We will add two different div containers now. Both will just contain a little text, container 1 and container 2. And the browser will show both containers in a new line each, because each of the containers will take up the full width of the screen. The other important container, which is commonly used in HTML, is the so-called span container. Other than the div container, the span container is an inline container and not a block container. Inline containers have the width of its contents and not of the full screen. Because of that, the browser shows the containers in the same line and not in new lines like block containers. Next, we are going to compare div and span containers side by side, to make the differences between block and inline containers more clear. Let's zoom into the browser preview and have a look at the containers. The two div containers, container 1 and container 2, are in separate lines because they take the full width of the screen. And the two inline containers are displayed in the same line. If we add a third inline container 3, it will be displayed in the same line as inline container 1 and inline container 2. You have already learned about many different HTML elements. What if I tell you that many of those elements are either inline or block elements, just as the div and the span container? Hyperlinks, for example, are inline elements. Let's add a link below the span containers and have a look at the browser. We will see that the link will be displayed in the same line as the span containers. Text paragraphs, on the other hand, are block containers, for example. Let's add two text paragraphs below the span containers to demonstrate this. When we have a look at the browser again, we will notice that both text paragraphs will be displayed below each other. The link is displayed in a new line now, because we have added the text paragraphs before the link. So let's add a second link below the first link to make clear that links are really inline elements and are displayed in the same line. Let's also add a placeholder href attribute to the links, so the links will be clickable and shown in the default link color. Now check out the browser again and you will see that the links will be displayed in the same line. If we are going to wrap the links in div containers, they will be displayed in a new line each, because their parent element is a block element. Have a look at the browser and you will see both links in a new line. In this lesson we will learn everything about forms in HTML. But what exactly is a form, you might wonder? Forms are one of the main ways how your users can interact with your websites. Users can enter data into a form, which will be sent to a server for further processing. For example, search fields. A user can input a search query, which is sent to a server, which will then deliver the search results. Or a contact form, which users can complete and send to get in contact with us. Or what about login forms? If your website features some kind of user accounts, you would at least need sign in and sign up forms. Interesting, right? But how to build forms with HTML? Let's jump straight into the code and find out. To create a form with HTML, we use the form tag. The action attribute of the form tag defines where to send the data when the form is submitted. But this goes beyond the scope of this tutorial, because we need some JavaScript to achieve that. So submitting forms and processing the data on the server will be covered in a future tutorial about JavaScript on this channel. So make sure to subscribe to not miss out on it. The same goes for the method attribute, so you don't have to learn it now. A form consists of input elements. To create an input element with HTML, we use the input tag. The input element is a self-closing element, which means it has no closing tag. By adding an input element without any attributes, we just create a basic text input field. Let's open the browser and have a look. And as you can see, we have just created a very basic text input field and we can type some text in it. Now it's time to create a more interesting form. What about creating a login form? First, we want to add a heading to make clear what kind of form it is. Next, we want to set the type attribute of our existing input element to email to make this input field only accept valid email addresses. There are many different values of the type attribute for the different kinds of data you can input into your form. For our basic login form, we need an email input, a password input, and a submit button. The email input we have already created, so let's create another input element and change the type to password. And a third one with the type submit for the submit button. Now it's time to open the form in the browser and have a look. And as you can see, we have two input fields and the submit button. So far, the user cannot understand which input field is used for the email address and which is used for the password, because we haven't created any labels yet. To add labels to a form with HTML, the label element is used. But before we can do that, we have to add a name and an ID to each of the input fields. So let's add the necessary attributes very quickly so we can continue. Let's start by creating the first label for the email input. So we are going to add a label element above the email input field. The for attribute connects the label to the corresponding input field. So you should set the for attribute to the same value as the ID. In this case, it is email. Okay, so let's repeat the step and create another label for the password input. If we open the form in the browser again, we will see our new labels next to the input fields. So now the user can see where to type email and password. An alternative to labels are placeholders. By using placeholders, you can show hints right inside of your input fields. You can create placeholders by using the placeholder attribute. After creating the login form, what do we need next? Of course, a sign-up form. So let's have a look how to build a sign-up form with HTML next. The first thing we want to do is wrap our input fields into div containers. So each input field appears in a new line. Let's verify that in the browser, and as you can see, email and password input fields are in separate lines. We want to give our users the possibility to sign up for our newsletter when using the sign-up form. So we will add radio buttons to our form to make that possible. To get started, we create another div container and a text paragraph within the container. Because we want to create two radio buttons, one button for yes and one button for no, we have to add two input elements. Radio button inputs have the type radio. And of course we want to set an ID. One is updates yes, and the other one will be updates no. Both input fields will have the same name, updates, because they are referring to the same data value, which is either yes or no. And of course we want some labels for our radio inputs, so we are going to create them just as we have done before for the text inputs. Let's check out the browser again. And as you can see, we have two radio buttons, yes and no, appearing below the text message, do you want to receive updates by mail? To set one of the radio buttons as default, we can use the checked attribute. We want the no option to be the default, so we set the checked attribute to this button. And as you can see, when we open the browser, the no button is pre-selected. We want that new users accept our terms and conditions. And we are going to use a checkbox input for that. To create a checkbox, we just add another input element. This time it has the type checkbox, and we want to add a label too. Let's open the browser again, and as you can see, our checkbox is displayed. We want our users to add their birthday, so we are going to add a date input to the form. By setting the type to date, we will get a cool looking date picker input field. Have a close look at our form now. It looks a little bit messy and unstructured, right? To structure a form into different groups using HTML, the field set element is used. So let's create different field sets for our form. But first let's add another text input for the name of the user. Now we can start to clean up our form using field sets. Let's group name and birthday together because they are both personal information. The legend element is used to add a label to a field set. In this case it is personal info. Okay, let's group the other input elements of our form into field sets. Email and password input should be one. Let's call it credentials. And the third field set should include the radio buttons and the checkbox. And let's call this one terms. Now we want to open it in the browser and have a look. Our form looks much more clean and organized because we have used field sets. And now finally, let's fill out all of the input fields of our sign-up form to test it. Congratulations, you have just created your first complex form with HTML. In this tutorial, we will learn everything about meta tags in HTML. The first question we will answer is, what are meta tags? The short answer is, meta tags are metadata which describe your web pages. Have a look at this search result page from Google. Meta tags are used to define the different parts of a search result, like the title for example. In this case, it's Wikipedia. Or the description, which is also defined by a meta tag. Without any more talking, let's jump into the code and learn how to use meta tags in HTML. We already learned about the title tag in a previous tutorial of this course. Actually, it's not a real meta tag, but the title tag influences the search results. So I included it into this tutorial as well. Okay, after adding the title tag, we will add our first real meta tag for the description of the page. So we write meta and set the name attribute to description. The name attribute of meta tags defines the type of the meta tag. In this case, we want to set the description, so we set the attribute to description. The content attribute defines the actual value of the meta tag. So here we write the description, which should appear in the search results. Okay, so now we have added title and description, and this is how it will appear in the search results of Google. Next, we're going to have a look at some other meta tags. Let's start with the keyword meta tag. This one is used to describe the keywords or topics of your web page. A long time ago, search engines used this meta tag to determine the topics of your web page. But this isn't the case anymore today. Another meta tag is the author meta tag. Search engines use the author meta tag sometimes to display information about the author of a web page, for example in news articles. To create an author meta tag, we set the name attribute to author and the content attribute to John Doe, for example. Next, we're going to have a look at another interesting thing we can achieve by using meta tags. We will learn how to refresh the page in a specific interval. To achieve that, we create a meta tag and set the HTTP equiv attribute to refresh. And next we set the content attribute to the amount of seconds which will trigger the interval. So let's set it to 5 because we want the page to refresh every 5 seconds. The viewport meta tag is another important meta tag. It gives the browser information about the area where the content is rendered. The viewport meta tag is important so your web pages look good on every device, even on small smartphone screens. We will have a closer look at the viewport meta tag in a future tutorial about responsive design on this channel. A good default viewport meta tag is setting the width to the width of the device and the initial scale to 1.0. The char set meta tag is used to define the character set used for displaying text on your website. UTF-8 is a good default char set to use, so we are going to use that one. The robots meta tag can be used to tell search engines and other robots how to handle the web page. For example, if you don't want your web page is listed in the search results of a search engine, you would have to set the noIndex property of the robots meta tag. And if we don't want that search engines follow the links on our websites, we have to set the nofollow property of the robots tag. The last tag we are going to have a look at is not a real meta tag as well, but I think it's important to mention it now. We can use the link tag to define a so-called canonical URL. If you have duplicate pages, the canonical URL points to the original page. Imagine you host the same website one time with www and one time without www. To avoid search engines indexing both of those versions, we set the canonical URL to the www version, so search engines only index the page once. Congratulations, you have learned all the basics of HTML now, and now it's time to move on to CSS. CSS is the styling language of the web, and it looks like that. Cool, right? But what does CSS stand for? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And as I've said before, it is the styling language of the web. A styling language can be used to change the visual appearance of websites. For example, you could use CSS to change the color of your texts. CSS works together with HTML. HTML is used to define the basic layout of websites, whereas CSS is used to change every little detail about how your website looks and feels. And just as HTML, CSS can be displayed in the browser. Have a look at this comparison. It shows the same Wikipedia article twice. To the left, CSS is enabled, and to the right, it is disabled. Do you see how ugly and messy the website looks with CSS disabled? I wanted to show you this comparison because I wanted to make clear how important CSS is to create beautiful websites. Next, we're going to learn how to add CSS to your websites. There are 3 different ways of how to add CSS to websites. The first one we're going to learn is inline CSS. With inline CSS, we write CSS code directly in the HTML by setting the style attribute of an HTML element. Here, we want to create a blue text, so we write the CSS rule color blue. Let's create another text paragraph, but this time we want to set the color to green. So we use the style attribute of the second text paragraph and add the CSS rule color green. Internal CSS is the second way of how to add CSS to a website. Let's first create 2 HTML elements, one h1 element and one paragraph element. To access the h1 element from the CSS code, we are going to set an ID. Let's set it to post title. IDs are unique identifiers and they only occur one time per page. There will be only one post title, so we are going to use an ID here. A post can have multiple post paragraphs, so we are going to set a class to the paragraph element. Classes are identifiers which can be used for multiple elements across the page. Now we have prepared the HTML and we are ready to add the internal CSS to the page. Internal CSS can be added to a web page by using the style tag. Basically, you can add the style tag anywhere on the page, but most of the times it's added to the head of the page. Within the style element, you create the CSS rules. To select an ID in a CSS rule, you have to use the hash character, followed by the name of the ID. And to select elements by its class in CSS, you have to use a dot followed by the name of the class. Okay, now we will have a look at external CSS. Other than for internal and inline CSS, where we write the CSS code in the HTML file, external CSS uses external CSS files. And to enable the CSS rules defined in an external file, we have to link it in the head of the HTML page. The linked file style.css have to be created, so let's do that. And let's add the same CSS rules for post title and post paragraph, like in the inline CSS example. Okay, enough of the theory, let's write a little bit CSS code now. I have prepared a simple HTML file, which hasn't any HTML elements yet. So let's create some. Let's first create an h1 element, which we are going to style with CSS in the next step. The heading will be CSS Basics, and we want to make the text a little bit smaller by using CSS. So we will use the style attribute to set the font size to 20 pixels. And as you can see in the browser to the right, the heading will be displayed a little bit smaller than before. And if we set the font size to 50 pixels, the heading will appear very, very large. Next, we want to create a text paragraph which has centered text. And in addition, its text should be bold. So first we are going to add the CSS code to center align the text. We achieve that by using text align center. As you can see in the browser, the text is centered. And to make the text bold, we add another CSS rule to the style attribute, font weight bold. and have another look at the browser, we will see the text is centered and bold, just as we wanted it. Okay, let's remove all the inline CSS now, because we want to have a closer look at internal CSS. Remember, to add internal CSS to a web page, we have to use the style element. So let's add one to the head of the page. We can also use CSS selectors to target specific HTML elements, even if they don't have any ID or class associated. We can just use the name of the tag we want to style, like h1, as an CSS selector. Let's do that, and let's create a very huge heading by setting the font size to 60 pixels. As you can see in the browser, we have just created a very large heading. We want to center the paragraph text again, so let's add a CSS rule to the p tag text align center. So let's add the font weight property and set it to bold like before. So now we have achieved the same appearance like we have just done before when we used inline CSS. Classes are a very important concept when using CSS because they allow us to reuse CSS stylings for different elements. Like for example, we want to have a red text multiple times on our page. We only have to create the CSS rule a single time, and we are then able to reuse the CSS definitions by assigning the specific class to the HTML element we want to apply the styles to. So let's assign the CSS class red text to both of the paragraphs, and as you can see in the browser, both texts will appear in red color. Now let's add two more CSS definitions for large and for small text, and setting the font size respectively. Large text should be a very large font size, let's say 25 pixels, and the CSS definition for the small text class should set the font size very small, let's say like 12 pixels. And now we can assign the classes to our HTML elements. Let's first change the red text class of the one paragraph to green text and add an additional class, large text. And as you can see in the browser, the text is large and green at the same time. We want to make the red text small, so let's assign the small text class to the text paragraph. And as you can see, the red text appears very small. The last thing we want to do is changing the size of our heading. So let's first set it to small text. And of course, that's a little bit too small for a heading. So let's change it to large text. It's still a little bit too small if you ask me. So let us create another CSS definition, extra large text, which has a font size of 60 pixels, and assign it to our heading to make it extra large. Have a look at the browser preview and you will see the heading is extra large. Colors are an essential part of styling a website with CSS. So let us learn how to use them. Have a look at this code. It defines a color in the most simple way, by using the name of the color. In this case, it's red. But there is a huge number of color names you could use. Basic ones like red, green or blue, but also fancy ones like tomato or salmon. But there are more ways to define colors in CSS. For example, RGB colors. By using RGB colors, you have total control over the color you want to display. RGB colors are mixed by values of the three primary colors red, green and blue. For example, if we mix red and blue, we will receive purple. CSS code for defining RGB colors looks like that. The RGB function has three different values. The first one for the red part of the color, the second one for the green, and the third one for the blue portion of the color. The values range from 0 to 255. But we can also use percentage values to define RGB colors, ranging from 0 to 100%. Have a look at both of these color definitions. They both define the same color, and this color is red. By using the RGB notation, you can define any color you want. Check out these examples to better understand it. Hex codes are another way to represent RGB colors. Have a look at this hex code. It represents the color red. Similar to RGB colors, hex colors consist of three different values. The first two characters encode the red value as a hex number. FF is just 255 in the hex system. The next two characters encode the green value of the color, and the last two characters define the value for the blue portion of the color. Next, we're going to have a quick look at the HSL color notation. HSL colors consist of three different values: hue, saturation, and lightness. In simple words, the hue value defines the base color, like red, green, or blue. The saturation determines the intensity of the color, and the brightness or lightness defines how bright the color should be. Okay, let's jump into the code and practice a little bit. I have prepared a simple HTML page containing 3 text paragraphs. And now we want to practice how to set the color of the text paragraphs by using the color names. The first text paragraph will be red. So let's use the style attribute to set the color to red. Let's open the browser, and as you can see, the first text paragraph appears in red. Let's repeat this step and set the color of the second text paragraph to green. And another time for the third text paragraph, this time we set it to blue. Check out the browser. Now we have 3 text paragraphs, one in red, one in green, and one in blue. Now we want to do the same thing, defining a red text paragraph, but this time we are going to use external CSS and the different color notations like RGB or hex colors. Let's start by defining the color by using the color name, just as we have done before when we used inline CSS. We have a paragraph and we assign the class red text to it. Now we head to our CSS file and we are going to write the CSS code for this class. We just set the color to red. And if we've done everything right, the browser will show a red text. Next, we're going to practice how to use the RGB notation to set the color to red. So let's use another class selector, red text RGB, which we will use to set the color using the RGB notation. But first, let's have a look at the color picker of our code editor. To open the color picker, just click on the red color next to line 2. The color picker shows us the values for the RGB notation, but also for the hex notation. Okay, so let's set the color to red by using RGB. The first value will be 255, the second value 0, and the third value 0 as well. In our HTML file, let's change the class to red text RGB and have a look at the browser. We will have another red text. Next, we're going to repeat the step to practice HSL colors. We add a class red text HSL and set the color to red by using HSL. And finally, we're using hex colors to set the text to red. We create another CSS rule with the class selector red text hex, and we're setting the text color to red by using the hex notation. The next thing we're going to learn is color opacity. You can add an alpha channel to any color to make it transparent. Maybe you have 2 HTML elements layered on top of each other and you want the color of the lower element shine through. So let's define a container and set the background color to blue. Have a look at the browser and you will see the text paragraph appearing in a blue container. Next, let's change the color of the paragraph to white to increase the contrast. Let's set the background color of the paragraph to red by using the RGB notation. The blue color of the container will disappear because the text paragraph and its red color overlays the container below it. Now we want the blue color of the container shine through, so we are using the RGBA color notation to define a RGB color with an alpha channel. The fourth value is used for the alpha channel, and the lower the value, the more transparent the color is. Let's set the height of the container to 500 pixels quickly and decrease the alpha value to 0.5, and we will see that both colors will blend into each other and create a purple. Now, if we set the alpha value to a really low number like 0.1, the red color will almost disappear. Another way to change how transparent or opaque an element is by using the opacity CSS property. If we set a really low value, the whole text paragraph will disappear because it is applied to the whole element and not only to the background color. Let's learn how to format text with CSS. Nobody in the world wants boring text like that. Instead, we want beautifully formatted text like that one. Your users will enjoy your websites a lot more. Okay, so let's have a look what we are going to learn. For example, we will learn how to change the size of text, the font family, the color, the background color, and a lot more. So let's jump into the code and start learning. I have prepared some text paragraphs for you, which we are going to style now step by step using CSS. We want to create a bold text, an italic text, an underlined text, and a striked through text. So let's open the styles.css file next and start writing the CSS code. We want to start with creating the bold text. The font weight property can be used to create a bold text with CSS. Just set the value of the font weight property to bold, and we have created our first bold text with CSS. We can also set the font weight property to a numeric value, ranging from 100 to 900. The higher the number, the bolder the text will be. Have a look, we have set the value to 600 and the text appears bold. Next, we're going to have a look on how to create italic text. To make a text italic using CSS, we have to use the font style property and set its value to italic. Have a look at the browser to the right and you will see the italic text. Let's continue by creating some underlined text. To make text underlined in CSS, we have to use the text decoration property and set the value of the property to underline. Check out the browser again and you will see some underlined text appearing. Okay, next let's have a look how to create striked through text. Striked through text is also created by using the text decoration property, but this time we have to set the value to line through. Have another look at the browser and you will notice the striked through text appearing. Next, we want to learn how to color a text using CSS. I have prepared some more text paragraphs for you and assigned appropriate CSS classes to them. Let's open our CSS file again to write the CSS code. First, we want to create a red text, so we set the color property to red. The second text paragraph will get a blue background, so we set the background color property to blue. Let's change the color to white to increase the readability and have a look at the browser preview to see the results. Now we will learn how to customize the typography using CSS. We will change the font size and font family, for example. Let's start by creating some large text. To change the size of text using CSS, we have to use the font size property. And let's set the value to 40 pixels to get a really large text. Next, let's change the font family, which can be achieved by setting the font family property. And have a look at the browser. The second text paragraph appears in a different font family. To change the space between each single line of text, we have to use the line height property. Let's play around by using some different values, while keeping an eye on the browser to see how the text will change. And to change the space between each single letter of text, we have to use the letter spacing property. Let's set it to 10 pixels and have a look at the browser, and we will notice that there are huge gaps between each single letter. Now if we set the letter spacing to -1 pixel, the text will become very narrow. And finally, if we want to change the space between each single word, we can use the word spacing property. Similar to the letter spacing, we can set it to positive values to increase the space, or negative value to decrease the space between each word. Now we will learn how to align text either right or center it. The text align property is used to align text. Let's set it to right to align the first paragraph to the right. Let's center the second paragraph, so we set the text align property to center. And as you can see, the second paragraph will be centered. We can also use CSS to customize the letter casing to create either uppercase, lowercase, or even capitalized text. Let's begin with uppercase. To create an uppercase text, we have to use the text transform property and set its value to uppercase. Have a look at the browser and you will see that every letter of the first text paragraph is uppercase. Creating lowercase text works the same way. We just have to set the text transform property to lowercase. And as you can see, every letter of the second text paragraph is lowercase. And finally, to capitalize each word of a text, we have to set the text transform property to capitalize. The last thing we are going to learn in this lesson is how to control the wrapping of text. Like when you have a very long piece of text which exceeds the size of the page, we want to be able to control exactly how line breaks are applied. We use the white space property to tell the browser whether he should or should not wrap a text. Have a look at both text paragraphs. The first one will wrap, so it doesn't exceed the size of the page, and the second one has no text wrapping, which means it will always exceed the page. The box model is an essential concept in CSS. All HTML elements can be considered as boxes, and using CSS we can customize the different properties of those boxes. Let's start learning. Each box consists of 4 different parts. First, the content, which is the actual content of the HTML element, for example, a text. Padding, border, and margin are the properties of the box. The padding defines the space between the border and the content of the box, and the margin defines the space between this box and other boxes. Okay, let's have a look at some code. I have prepared a simple HTML file with 3 containers, and each container just have a simple text in it. Let's write some CSS code to define the boxes. We want to add the stylings to each of the div containers, so we use the div selector. First, let's define the margin. Let's just set it to 40 pixels. And as you can see, there is now some spacing between each of the containers. Next, we are going to set a border around the boxes. Let's create a solid border which is 2 pixels wide and red. And as you can see, each of the containers has a border around the box. Now it's time to add some padding, which is the size between the content of the containers and the border. And have a look at the browser. Between the border of each container and its text, there is some spacing. What if we only want to have some spacing to the left or to the top of a box? No problem, we can also achieve that easily by using CSS. Let's try it out for container 1. If we define a padding using 2 values, the first value defines top and bottom paddings, and the second value defines left and right. If we use 3 values, the first one defines the top padding, the second the left and right padding, and the third one the bottom padding. And if we use 4 values, the first one is for the top padding, the second one for the right, the third one for the bottom, and the fourth one for the left padding. And margin works just the same way. And we can also define bottom, top, left, and right paddings and margins specifically by using the margin bottom CSS rule, for example. Let's give container 1 a margin bottom and container 3 a margin top. And as you can see, each container is spaced evenly. And finally, let's give the second container a margin left to make it appear indented. And of course, we can do the same things with padding. Let's give container 1 a padding bottom and padding top rule. And have a look at the browser, it will have a padding bottom and padding top. The last interesting thing about the CSS box model is the so-called box sizing. By using the box sizing, we can define how the width of a box is calculated. The default value for box sizing is content box. A content box doesn't include the border and the padding in the width of the box. A border box, on the other hand, includes the border and the padding in the width of the box. Have a look at the browser, and as you can see, container 2, which is set to border box, appears small because the padding and the border are included in the width of 100 pixels. Let's learn how to size elements using CSS. In this lesson you will learn step by step everything you need to know about sizing your HTML elements. Basically, there are 2 main dimensions when sizing elements. The height is the vertical dimension of an element, and the width is the horizontal dimension. Let's have a look at some code. As always, I have prepared a simple HTML file for you with 3 containers, which we are going to size next. Let us start defining the width of container 1. To define the width of an element using CSS, we have to use the width property. Let's set the value to 100 pixels. Let's continue defining the height by setting the height property to a value of 200 pixels. Now let's have a look at the browser, and as you can see, container 1 has a different size than container 2 and 3. Let's practice that a little bit more by setting the width and height of container 2. Let's turn it around and set the width to 200 pixels and the height to 100 pixels this time. Check out the result in the browser. We could also use percentage values instead of pixel values for defining width and height. So let's set the width of container 3 to 50% and observe the result in the browser. Now, if we change the width of the browser window, the width of container 3 will always be 50% of the width of the browser window. And of course, we can also use percentage values for the height of an element. So let's set the height of container 3 to 10%. Next, I'm going to introduce you to viewport values. Let's change the width of container 1 to 100 VW. But what does VW mean, you might wonder? It's pretty easy. 100 VW means 100% of the width of the browser window. The dimensions of the browser window are also called viewport. That's what the V in VW stands for. VH is the same thing as VW, but for the height and not the width. But what is the difference between a width of 100% and 100 VW? Because at first, they might look like doing the same thing, but they are not. Let me demonstrate this. First, let's add another container around container 1 and give it the ID parent1. Next, let's set the width of parent1 to 300 pixels. The width of 50% of container 1 is now referring to the 300 pixels of parent1. 50% of 300 pixels are 150 pixels, and as you can see, container 1 takes up half of the size of its parent. Now let's change the width of container 1 to 80% and have a look at the browser again. We will see that container 1 takes up 80% of its parent. Let's change the width of container 1 back to 50%. And as you can see, container 2 is larger than container 1, and that's because the 50% of container 1 are referring to the width of parent 1, and the 50% of container 2 are referring to the width of the browser window. It's also possible to limit the maximum width and height by using the max width and max height properties. I have already set some max width properties to the containers. Have a look. If I decrease the size of the browser window and increase it again, the size will stop growing at one point. It will stop growing when the size of each container reaches its max width definition. Of course, we can also set a maximum height by using the max height property. Let's put some more text into container 3 to demonstrate the max height. And now, with a max height of 200 pixels, we can notice in the browser that the height of the content is bigger than the height of container 3, because we have limited it to 200 pixels. Knowing how to position elements with CSS is very important for building websites with a great layout. So in this lesson, we will learn step by step everything about how to position elements using CSS. So let's get started. In CSS, the position property is used to tell an element how it should be positioned. The position property can have different values. The default value is static. With position static, elements are positioned according to the normal flow of the document. Have a look at this HTML page, for example. We have 3 different div containers, and because div containers are block elements, they are positioned below each other, taking up the whole width. And have a look at this HTML page. Here we have 1 div container and 2 span containers. The div container taking up the whole width, whereas the span containers take up only the space they need, because they are inline containers. We can change whether an element is inline or block by using the display CSS property. Let's make the div container inline, so we set the display property to the value of inline. And as you can see in the browser, now we have 3 different inline containers. Next, let's set the span containers to block and have a look at the result in the browser. Let's have a look at another way of positioning elements with CSS. With relative position, we can position elements relative to their original position. Let's have a look at the code to understand how it works. This HTML page has 3 different boxes, and we want to use relative positioning to position box 1 now. So first we set the position property to relative. Next we set the left property to 100 pixels. Don't be confused. By setting the left property, we move the element to the right and not to the left. It's like the distance the left side of the box should move. In this case, it's a positive value, 100 pixels. If we would set a negative value, the box would move to the left. Next, we want to move the box down by 150 pixels. So we set the top property to 150 pixels. Notice how box 2 and box 3 don't take up the original space of box 1, because relatively positioned elements aren't removed from the document flow. Next, we're going to learn about absolute positions. They behave differently than relatively positioned elements because first, they are removed from the normal document flow, so other elements take up the original position of an absolutely positioned element. And second, they aren't positioned relative to their original position, but instead relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. Let's have a look at some code. The first thing we need to do to demonstrate absolute positioning is creating an ancestor for box 2. So let's create a div container around box 2 and give it the ID parent2. Now back to the CSS, we first want to set the height of parent2 to 200 pixels and the width to auto. And then we set the position property of box 2 to absolute and the top offset to 100 pixels. Have a look at the browser. Parent2, the ancestor of box 2, is not positioned. That's why box 2 is positioned relative to the browser window. Let's change the top offset to 0 pixels and add a left offset of 50 pixels to box 2 and have a look at the browser again. Box 2 is positioned at the top of the page. Now watch carefully because we will set parent2 to position relative. Now, because parent2 is the nearest positioned ancestor of box 2, the top offset of box 2 is now relative to the position of parent2. Let's change the top offset to 100 pixels to demonstrate it even better. Now we can see very clearly that the top offset of 100 pixels is relative to the position of parent2. Next up, we will have a look at the fixed position. HTML elements with fixed position are always displayed at the same location of the screen, regardless of how much the user has scrolled the page. In other words, they are relative to the viewport. Let's jump into the code and set the position property of box 3 to fixed. Let's set the top offset to 50% because we want to display box 3 in the middle of the screen. And as you can see, it doesn't matter how much we scroll the page, box 3 always remains in the same spot. Sticky position is similar to fixed position with a small but interesting difference. When we scroll past an element with position sticky, it will behave similar to a fixed position and remain at the location defined by the top left, right and bottom offsets. So let's set the position property of box 3 to sticky and define a top offset of 0 pixels. Now let's scroll the page and as soon as we reach box 3, it will stick to the top of the page and remain there until we scroll up again and reach its original position. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is how to control the floating behavior of HTML elements. Here we have an HTML page which contains an image and some text, and we want to let the text float around the image. We can achieve that by using the float property. Let's set the float property to left, and as you can see, the image is positioned to the left and the text to the right. And if we change the float property to right, the image will be positioned to the right. In this tutorial, we will learn everything about the flex layout in CSS. The flex layout is one of the most powerful tools in modern web design. It allows you to create flexible layouts easily. But what exactly is the flex layout? The flex layout is also known as flexible box layout or simply flexbox. Now when I say flex, I don't mean flexing muscles. It's about flexibility. The flex layout makes your layouts flexible and adaptable to different screen sizes. You can use it to align elements in rows and dynamically fill additional space. And you can also use Flexbox to align your elements in columns. So let me give you some reasons why you should use Flex Layout in CSS. First, it allows you to create flexible layouts. Second, you can use it to make all elements the same width. You can vertically center elements and create columns which have the same height. But there's a lot more to learn about the Flex layout, so let's jump into the code and learn the details. But before we start, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can help even more people learning to code. Okay, so let's get started. I have prepared a simple HTML page for you, which only contains 3 different boxes. And now we want to create our first flex layout. To make an HTML element flex, we have to give it the display flex property. Have a look at the browser and you will notice that the 3 boxes are appearing in the same row. That's because the default flex direction is row. You can change the flex direction by using the flex direction property. Let's set it to column. Check out the browser and you will notice that all boxes will be displayed in a single column. Now I want to show you how we can make a box grow to fill up additional space. To make flex items grow, we have to use the flex grow property. Let's set it to 1 for box 2 and have a look at the browser again. And as you can see, box 2 grows to fill up the additional space of the row. Next, let's set the flex grow property of box 3 to 1 as well. Now both box 2 and box 3 will grow by the same amount of space. Now if we change flex grow of box 3 to 2, box 3 will take up more of the additional space. To be exact, it will take 2 times more of the additional space than box 2, because the value of flex grow is relative to other flex items. Similar to flex grow, we can use flex shrink to let items shrink and give some additional space to other flex items. The flex basis property sets the initial size of a flex item before the additional space is distributed according to the flex grow and flex shrink properties. What if we want to have some spacing between the boxes? Of course, we could just set some good old margin, but Flexbox has some special property for that. I'm talking about the gap property. But before we can see the gap property in action, let's remove the margin and the padding from the box and set a width and height of 150 pixels. And as you can see, there's no space between the boxes now. So we are going to set a gap of 20 pixels to the container class. And as you can see in the browser, there will be some space between the boxes. Keep in mind that the gap property only works for flex items. Now we will learn how to align flex items. First we will have a look how to center content within a box. So let's make the boxes flex containers as well by setting the display property to flex. And for centering the content within the boxes, we have to set the justify content property to center. Justify content aligns items along the flex direction. Remember, the default flex direction is row, so it aligns the content horizontally. And similar to the justify content property, the align items property is used to align items in the opposite flex direction. And because here the flex direction is row, it aligns the items vertically. I have changed the height of the boxes to different values, so we can have a look at some other cool features of Flexbox for aligning items. For example, we could set align items to baseline to display the content of all 3 boxes in the same line, even though they have different heights. And if we set align items to flex start, the boxes will be aligned at the top, and flex end will align the items to the bottom of the container. And to stretch the items to take up the full height, we can set align items to stretch. Let's set the height of the container to 500 pixels and remove the individual height properties from each single box. And now we can see in the browser that all 3 boxes are stretched to the height of the container. If we change the height of the container to 200 or 100 pixels, the boxes will stretch accordingly. Okay, back to the boxes with different heights again, and I also set the flex basis of the 3 boxes to 50 pixels. Let's set the justify content property to space between to align the boxes taking up the full width and distribute the additional space of the row evenly between the boxes. And space around can be used to distribute the additional space around the boxes. If you compare the result to space between, there will be also some spacing to the left and to the right. We can also have elements wrapped to the next row if they are larger than the current row. To achieve that, we have to use the flex wrap property. When you set flex wrap to wrap, the items will wrap to the next row. When you set it to wrap reverse, the items will be wrapped too, but in reverse order. Have a look at the browser to understand what I mean. When we resize the browser window, the boxes will wrap to a new row as soon as there isn't enough space in the current row. Do you remember how we used justify content and align items for aligning flex items within a flex container? Of course you do. Similar to that, you can also align flex items individually by using the align self property. And what if we want to take full control over the order of our boxes? We can do that easily by using the order property. Let's change the order of the boxes a little bit by setting the order property for each of the boxes. Keep in mind that the lowest order is 0 and not 1. And now have a look at the browser. Box 3 is the second box now and box 2 the fourth. Okay, the last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is something which could potentially save you some time when creating flex layouts with CSS. You can combine flex grow, flex shrink, and flex spaces in a single property, which is just flex. The flex shorthand property can have up to 3 different values. If it just has a single value and this value is numeric, like 2, it defines flex grow. And if the single value of the flex property has a unit, like pixels, it defines the flex spaces. And if it has 3 values, the first one is flex grow, the second one flex shrink, and the third one flex spaces. The CSS grid layout is a game-changing tool for creating complex layouts for your websites. But what exactly is a grid layout? A very basic grid could look like that. And a more complex one, containing the most important parts of a website, could look like this. In general, grids consist of columns and rows. And this is some basic code for creating a grid with CSS. To enable the grid layout for a container, we have to set the display property to grid. And then if we set grid template columns to 3 × 50 pixels, we are creating a grid with 3 columns, which are 50 pixels in size. And now let's jump into the code and have a look at the details. But before we start, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can help even more people learning about the CSS grid layout. Okay, so let's get started. As always, I have prepared a simple HTML file for you, which only consists of 9 different containers. And we want to create a grid for the containers now. So to enable the grid, we have to set the display property to grid. Okay, but as you can see, nothing has changed in the browser, because we haven't defined any columns or rows yet. So let's use the grid template columns property to define columns. We start out with a single column, which is 150 pixels wide. And as you can see, the width of the column changes to 150 pixels. Let's define a second column, which is 100 pixels in size. And as you can see in the browser, now we have 2 columns. And the containers are placed into the columns automatically. Let's add a third column. And this time it should be 100 pixels again. Great! Now have a look at the browser and you will see that our 3 columns will appear according to our code. We have only worked with pixel values so far, but we can also use percentage values for defining our columns. Let's try it out by creating 3 columns, which have a size of 33% each. Similar to the grid template columns property, the grid template rows property works to define the sizes of rows. Check it out, we have just set the size of the first row to 200 pixels. Let's continue and set the second row to 100 pixels and the third row to 200 pixels. The min-max function can help us creating grids which are responsive. That means that the size of a column or row adjusts to the available screen size. The min-max function takes 2 arguments. The first one defines the minimum size and the second one the maximum size. Setting the maximum size to auto will make the column grow infinitively. Now let's have a look what will happen if we change the size of the browser window. We decrease the size of the window and the column will shrink until it reaches the 100 pixels minimum size. Next, let's try out the min-max function for the rows, and let's set the minimum size of the first row to 200 pixels and the maximum size to auto again. To make that work, we have to set the height of the container to 100%. When we decrease the height of the browser window now, we will see that the first row will shrink until it reaches its minimum size of 200 pixels. The repeat function is another very helpful tool we can use for creating our grids. The repeat function also has 2 arguments. The first one defines how many times we want to repeat a row or column, and the second argument defines the size. In this case, we want to create 3 columns of 150 pixels and 3 rows of 150 pixels. Have a look at the browser and you will see that our containers are little squares now. So far we have only worked with pixel values and percentage values, but grids introduce a whole new unit to CSS, the so-called fraction unit. Using the fraction unit we can also create responsive grids similar to the min-max function. You can compare the fraction unit to the flex, grow and shrink properties of the flex layout. Here we have created 3 columns. The first and second column are 1 fraction wide and the third column 2 fractions. So we have a total of 4 fractions. So 2 fractions is equal to 50% and 1 fraction is equal to 25%. And if we change the third value to 4 fractions, we will have a total of 7 fractions. So 1 fraction will be approximately 14% and 2 fractions 28%. Next we're going to learn how to define gaps between the rows and columns of a grid. So I already have removed the margins from the containers, so we are ready to define the gaps now. To define the gaps between the rows of a grid, we have to use the grid row gap property. Let's set it to 50 pixels. And to achieve the same thing for the columns, we have to use the grid column gap property. And now have a look at the browser and you will see that we have gaps between the columns and the rows of our grid. The grid gap property allows us to create gaps for rows and columns with just a single property. The first value defines the gaps between the rows, and the second defines the gaps between the columns of our grid. Aligning items within our grids works similar to the flex layout. We can use the same properties like justify content and align content or align items, and giving them values like space around, space between or space evenly to distribute our items across the screen. And the center value is used for centering our items, of course. Up until now, all of our grid items are only taking up a single cell of the grid, but the CSS grid layout allows us to span items across multiple cells of the grid. Let's have a look at how to accomplish that. To make an item span multiple columns of the grid, we can use the grid column start property, which defines the column where the item should start, and the grid column end property, which defines where the item should end. To make box 1 span the whole grid, we set the grid column start to 1 and grid column end to 4. But wait, why 4 and not 3? Our grid only have 3 columns. The answer to that is very simple. The values are not referring to the actual column, but to the column lines to the left and right of the columns. Have a look at the browser and the numbers on top of the grid. They are indicating the column lines. So now the values 1 and 4 for grid column start and grid column end make sense, right? Now we want to repeat that, but this time we want to span the item across multiple rows. So we set the grid row start property to 2 and the grid row end property to 6. Have a look at the grid and the row line numbers and you will see that box 2 spans from row line 2 to 6. Defining grid column start and grid column end with just a single property is also possible by using grid column. It has 2 values separated with a slash, where the first one is grid column start and the second one is grid column end. And of course we can do the same thing with grid row and it works just the same way like grid column. 2 values separated by a slash. We can even take it to the next level by combining all 4 values into a single property, the grid area property. The first 2 values represent grid row start and grid column start, and the last 2 values represent grid row end and grid column end. Next, let's practice another very cool feature of the CSS grid layout. I'm talking about grid template areas. I have prepared 4 different containers for you, representing the main layout parts of a typical website: header, content, sidebar, and footer. And now we are going to learn how to use grid template areas to position the containers in a grid. The grid template areas property takes a single string for each row of the grid, and inside of the row we define the columns, which are separated by a space. We can give the columns any name we want, basically similar to setting an ID to an HTML element. We want to create a 2-column grid, and we want the header to span the 2 columns, so we write header space header. In the second row we want to display the content to the left and the sidebar to the right, so we write content space sidebar. And in the third row we want the footer to span 2 columns, just like the header, so we write footer space footer. But before our grid template areas will work, we have to define the areas to each of the containers. Let's start with the header and set the grid area property to header. And repeat the step for content sidebar and footer. And as you can see, our grid will take up the shape, just as we have defined it with the grid template area property. Header and footer take up 2 columns, whereas content and sidebar share a single row. What if the content is too large for an HTML element? In that case, we can use CSS for controlling the overflowing behavior and for styling the scroll bars. Let's jump straight into the code and learn how. I have created an HTML page for you, which has a single box containing a text and an image. As you can see, the content overflows the boundaries of the container. By setting the overflow property to auto, scroll bars will be displayed if the content is out of bounds. Check out the browser. We have to scroll horizontally to see all the content. But what if we just want the overflowing content to be hidden? No problem, we can just set overflow to hidden and the content will be cut off. And setting overflow to scroll will give us always visible scroll bars, even if the content fits the container. Let's set overflow back to auto again and increase the width of the image to 600 pixels. Now we have a horizontal scroll bar as well, because the image is wider than the container. To control only the horizontal overflow, we have to use the overflow X property. Let's set it to hidden. Now the horizontal scroll bar has disappeared. And to do the same thing with the vertical scroll bar, we have to set overflow Y to hidden. Check out the browser. No vertical scroll bar anymore. Next, let's make the scroll bars more beautiful. By using the WebKit scroll bar selector, we can style the scroll bar. Here we have set its width to 10 pixels. Let's customize the track of the scrollbar next. The WebKit scrollbar track selector can do that. We want to make the background gray. Have a look at the result. The scrollbar has a gray background now, but there is still no thumb, which shows us how much we have scrolled. WebKit scrollbar thumb can be used for that. Let's give it a purple background. Now we got a fully functional scrollbar, a purple thumb on a gray background. Let's change it to black, because now we want to make it purple only when we hover over it with the mouse. We create another WebKit scrollbar thumb selector, but this time followed by hover. Now the black color turns purple as soon as we touch the thumb with our mouse. Shadows in CSS are like the salt in the soup for creating beautiful website elements. With box shadows, we can add shadows to boxes, like those beautiful shadows for example. And text shadows can be used to add pretty shadow effects to text. Okay, let's have a look at the code and learn how. First, we want to create a box shadow. If the box shadow property has 2 pixel values, like here, the first one defines the horizontal length of the shadow on the x-axis, and the second, the vertical length on the y-axis. Let's add a third value for the blur distance of the shadow. The blur makes our shadow more smooth. Have a look at the browser. We can customize the color by adding a color value at the end or beginning of the values. Let's make the shadow green. A 4th pixel value before the color defines the spread radius. Positive values let the shadow grow, negative values let it shrink. And setting the inset value will make the shadow display on the inside of the box. We can add opacity to the shadow by using RGBA colors, which have an alpha channel. So the background color will shine through the shadow. Next, we will have a look at text shadows. Let's create a text shadow for the text paragraphs of the box. So we add the text shadow property to the P selector. This creates a shadow in tomato red with a length of 1 pixel on both the X and Y axis. And when we change the X and Y length to 10 pixels, the shadow looks like that. Now, the heading will get a text shadow too. Let's create a cyan shadow with a length of 5 pixels on both axes and a blur of 1 pixel. Have you ever wondered how to make elements on your website scale, rotate, or move with just a few lines of code? I remember how exciting it was when I first learned CSS transformations. Join me as I show you how to use scale, translate, and rotate with CSS. Okay, let's dive in. We start with a simple HTML page with a single image on it. I've already centered the image using Flexbox. And now we're going to use the transform property to scale the image by factor 2. So we write scale and the number 2 in parentheses. Now we got an emoji which is twice as large than before. In other words, 600 pixels. Next I want to show you how to move the image. We have to use translate for that. So we write translate and in parentheses we add two length values. The first one for the horizontal movement along the x-axis and the second one for the y-axis. Check out the browser, we just moved the image 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down. And to rotate the image, we have to write rotate and the number of degrees for the rotation inside the parentheses. Let's rotate the emoji by 180 degrees to flip it upside down. And let's play around with some other degree values like 90 or minus 90 degrees. We can also add multiple transformations with the single transform property. So let's scale the image by the factor 1.5 and rotate it by 45 degrees. Have a look at the browser to see the result. Cool, right? Let's do a little recap about what we have learned so far. With transform translate, we can move HTML elements. Transform scale changes the size of an HTML element. And transform rotate rotates the element by a specific number of degrees. CSS animations are a cool way to add life to your websites. The word animation comes from the Latin word anima, which means life or soul. When I first learned CSS animations, I thought, wow, so cool! But why so hard to understand? So let me help you learn CSS animations step by step. Okay, so let's jump straight into the code and start learning. Take a look at this simple page I prepared for you with a box on it. First, we will use CSS transitions to smoothly change the box color. To create a transition with CSS, we have to use the transition property. The first value is the CSS property for which we want to create the transition for. In our case, we want to create a transition for the background color. The second value is for the duration of the animation. We want to set it to 3 seconds. And the third value we set to linear because we want to have a linear transition. And last, we have to set the initial background color. Let's set it to tomato. We want the element to change its color to cyan when we hover over it with the mouse. So let's create a hover selector for the color transition class and set the background color to cyan. Now take a look at the browser. As soon as we hover over the box, the color starts changing. That's because our transition is triggered. Let's create a transition for a different CSS property now. Let's say the font size. So we change the first value of the transition property background color to font size and replace the background color property with the font size property. Let's set the initial font size to 20 pixels. And when we hover over the box, we want the font size to change to 40 pixels. So let's take a look at the result in the browser. When we hover the element, the font size transitions to 40 pixels. And if we remove the mouse from the element, it changes back to 20 pixels. Okay, transitions are cool, but let's have a look at real animations next. Let's create a bounce animation. And this is how the final result will look like. To define an animation with CSS, we have to define keyframes. A keyframe is like a snapshot that captures an important moment in your animation. Think of it as a bookmark that marks where something changes, like an object's position or size. And the other frames in between the keyframes are filled automatically by the animation. To define the keyframes for our animation, we have to write @keyframes followed by the name of the animation, in our case, bounce in. So to define a keyframe now, we have to write a percentage value, which indicates the position of the keyframe within the animation. So if we define a keyframe at 0%, it means this keyframe is just at the beginning of the animation. At the beginning of our bounce in animation, we want the box to appear very small. So we use a scale transformation to bring the image down to the factor 0.1. Let's define a second keyframe at 60% of the animation and let's scale the box to 1.2. So between the beginning of the animation and 60% of the animation, the image will scale from 0.1 to 1.2. And at 100% of the animation, we want to scale the box to the factor 1. Now there's only one step missing for our animation to work. The box has the class bounce in. So we set animation duration to 2 seconds and the animation name to bounce in. The animation name is the name we have set when we created the keyframes. And finally, we can see our animation in action. Take a look at the browser. The box is bouncing in now. Okay, let's learn a second, more complex animation next. We want the element dangle before falling down. And I have prepared another HTML page containing only an image which we are going to animate. First, we have to define the keyframes again. So we write keyframes followed by the animation name and we want to call the animation dangle fall. Let's define our first keyframe at 0% again and define the animation timing function. We are going to set it to ease in, out, which means that the animation is speeding up and slowing down again. Next, we're going to create two keyframes at the same time. We can just write two percentage values separated by a comma to achieve that. At 20 and 60% of the animation, we want to add a 3D rotation. Three-dimensional rotations can be created using the Rotate 3D transformation. Rotate 3D has 4 different arguments, the first 3 defining the x, y, and z axis values, and the fourth value defining the amount of degrees for the rotation. So we want the image rotating along the z-axis by 80 degrees. And at 40 and 80% of the animation, we want to do the same thing and rotate the image along the z-axis, but this time by 60 degrees. Those 4 rotations creating the dangle effect. But we want the image to fade out as well, so we set the opacity to 1. And our final keyframe, this time we use 2 and not 100%, will get a transformation as well, but this time we want to translate the image to make it fall down at the end of the animation. So we translate it by 700 pixels along the y-axis. And to make the image fade out at the end of the animation, we set the opacity to 0. And finally, we have to set the duration and the name of the animation to enable it. And the last very important property we have to set is the transform origin property, which sets the point around which a transformation is applied to. In our case, we want the image to rotate around the top left corner. Finally, it's time to see our animation in action. Have a look at the image. At first, it dangles from left to right, and then it will fall down. And you can also notice the fade out effect. Let's dive into CSS variables, a powerful feature that makes style sheets more flexible and maintainable, perfect for creating consistent themes. I will also show you the calc function, which allows for dynamic calculations right in CSS. With CSS variables, you can define values once and reuse them, keeping the code cleaner and easier to manage. Imagine creating a dark mode with just a few changes. CSS variables make this simple and efficient. Let's learn how. We start with an HTML page containing some content elements, 2 different headings, an image, and 2 text paragraphs. And I've already written some CSS code as well for setting up the basic styling of the page. And next, we are going to use CSS variables to replace the absolute values in our CSS code. To define our variables globally, that means our variables can be accessed from everywhere, we use the root Pseudo class. Let's define our first variable. For the font size of the H1 heading, variable definitions always start with a double dash, followed by the variable name. Let's call it H1 font size. Then we have to write a colon, and after that, the value of the variable. Let's set it to a very large value, like 50 pixels. Nice, we have defined our first variable. Now we can apply it to the H1 selector. To apply variables in CSS, we have to use the var function. And inside parentheses, we write the name of the variable we want to apply. So let's define our newly created variable to the font size property. Check out the browser and you will see that the H1 heading is now very large. We had so much fun with our first variable that we will define another one right away. Let's create a variable for the H3 font size. It should be a little smaller than the H1 size, so we set it to 40 pixels. And now we are going to apply it to the font size property of the H3 selector using the var function again. Take a look at the browser and you will see that the size of the H3 heading has changed. Let's repeat those steps, this time for the body font size. And of course we have to apply the variable to the P selector. We have only defined variables for font sizes so far. Let's create one for the width of the image next. Let's name it featured image width and give it the value of 300 pixels. And of course we have to apply the variable, but this time to the width property. We can also define colors as variables. Let's create one for the page background and set it to green. We are going to apply it to the background color property of the body selector, just to find out that green backgrounds look bad. So let's change it quickly to black. And also create a variable for the text color. We want the text to be white. And as always, we have to apply the variable, this time to the color property. Cool, now we have created a dark version of our website, but we want it to be able to switch between light and dark mode. Let's take a look how to achieve that. First, we reset page background to white and text color to black. And then we define a class selector and name it dark mode. Now we copy and paste our page background and text color variables to the dark mode selector and change page background to black and text color to white. To enable the dark mode now, we only have to add the dark mode class to the body element. And if we remove the dark mode class, the light mode will be enabled again. Next, we will explore how to perform calculations directly within CSS using the powerful calc function. So first we create a new variable, base font size, and we will use it to calculate all the other font sizes based on this variable. To do calculations in CSS, we have to use the calc function. Let's calculate the h1 font size to be 2.5 times the base font size. 2.5 times 18 pixels is 45 pixels. Let's do another calculation for the h3 font size, which we want to be 1.8 times the base font size. Finally, let's apply the base font size variable to the body font size variable, and let's play around with different values of the base font size variable. And as you can see in the browser, we only have to change the base font size, and all the 3 other font sizes will change accordingly. CSS media queries are the key to making your websites responsive. When I first learned about media queries, they completely changed the way I build websites. Let me guide you step by step on how to use them to ensure your site looks great on any device. So let's jump in and learn CSS media queries. Happy learning! We start off with a very simple HTML page containing an h1 heading and a text paragraph. It's important that we set the viewport meta tag for the media queries to work. And now it's time to jump into the CSS code and write our first media query. Media queries always start with @media. Then in parentheses we define a min width of 500 pixels. This means the browser window must be at least 500 pixels wide for this media query to be activated. And now we can write CSS rules inside the media query, which will override the normal CSS rules when the media query is activated. Let's set the text color of the body to red and take a look at the browser, and we will see that the text is red because the width of the browser is 768 pixels, which is more than the 500 pixels min width of our media query. Now let's change the width of the browser a little bit, and we will notice that as soon as the width drops below 500 pixels, the color changes to black, because the condition of the media query, min width of 500 pixels, isn't true anymore. And when the width of the browser is above 500 pixels, the color turns to red again. With media queries, you can also control the device type for which the media query should be applied. This media query, for example, would only be applied to the printed version of the page. If we want the media query to work for all device types, we have to use the all keyword. And if we only want to target screens, we have to use the screen keyword. It's also possible to define multiple conditions in a single media query. To add another condition, we just have to use the and keyword and then write the other condition. Let's add a second condition, max width 600 pixels. Now our media query only gets activated if the screen is between 500 and 600 pixels wide. Let's try it out in the browser, and as you can see, at 599 pixels, the color turns to red, and at 499 it turns to black again. Okay, now you understand the basics about media queries. It's time to practice them with a real-world example. Here we have a website with a website header, a content area, and a sidebar. And we will use media queries to optimize the layout for different screen sizes. Okay, let's create our first media query. We want the sidebar to be full width on small devices. So we create a media query with max width 700 pixels and set the width of the sidebar to 100%. Take a look at the browser. As soon as the width is below 700 pixels, the sidebar will be full width and displayed below the content area. Let's also disable the border of the sidebar to make it look more beautiful. And now let's set order to -1 to make the sidebar appear on top of the page above the header. We also want to decrease the size of the title in the header, so we set the font size of the h1 to 40 pixels. Let's define another media query for very small devices, smaller than 450 pixels. And let's decrease the padding of content and sidebar to 10 pixels to give more space to the content. Congratulations, you have now created your first responsive website. Hi, in this tutorial we will learn everything about combinators in CSS. Do you remember? HTML documents are structured in a tree-like format called the DOM. By using combinators we have total control over writing CSS selectors that can target nearly any element within the DOM. For example, the descendant selector. In this example, the background color property is applied to every text paragraph that is a descendant of a div container. Take a look at this HTML page. It contains some headings and paragraphs. All of them, except one paragraph, are located inside a container. And now we want to write a CSS selector, selecting only the paragraphs inside of the container. So first we write .container to select the div which has the container class, followed by a space and P for selecting the text paragraphs. Take a look at the browser and you will see that all of the text paragraphs are blue, except the last one, because it's not inside of the container. The child selector is similar to the descendant selector, but it only selects direct descendants. In other words, children of the parent element. Let's write a selector for all h2 headings, which are children of the container element. To create a child selector, we have to use the greater than sign. So we write .container greater than h2. Take a look at the browser and you will see that all the h2 headings are green now. The next combinator is the so-called adjacent selector. Adjacent selectors select elements that occur immediately after another element on the same level of the DOM. Adjacent selectors are created using the plus sign. Let's make all of the paragraphs red, which occur immediately after an h2 heading. So we write h2 plus p and set the color to red. The last combinator we will have a look at is the so-called general sibling combinator. This selects all siblings which are on the same level but not necessarily immediately after another element. To create a general sibling selector, we have to use the tilde character. Let's make all of the paragraphs bold, which are siblings of h1 headings. To sum it up, the descendant selector is used, which are below an element in the hierarchy of the DOM. The child selector only selects direct descendants of an element. The adjacent combinator selects elements which are placed immediately after the other element. And finally, the general sibling combinator selects elements on the same level of the DOM, but don't need to be immediately after the other element. Ever wanted to add some cool effects to your website without messing up your HTML? Let me show you how to use pseudo elements in classes in CSS. These little tricks make it super easy to style specific parts of your page and add content without any extra code. It's a game changer for styling your websites. Let's jump in. We start off with a simple HTML page, which has only some elements on it, an h1 heading, a text paragraph, and an unordered list. And now we are going to use CSS for styling the pseudo elements. To create stylings for pseudo elements, we have to write a normal selector, like P in this case, followed by two colons, and then after or before. Here we want to create a pseudo element after the text paragraph, so we write P : after. And then we can use the content property to create some content, like here, a funny list emoji, which is not part of the DOM, but still it will be displayed in the browser. Have a look. Similar to the after pseudo element, we can create a before element, which will be rendered before. In this case, it will be shown before every list item of the list. So we use the content property again to show a little check mark before each of the list items. Take a look at the browser. Before each of the list items, we have now a little check mark. Now let's learn to use the first pseudo class. Pseudo classes are created similar to pseudo elements, but instead of two colons, we have to use only one. So if, for example, we want to target the last list item of the list, we can write ULLI : last child. Let's increase the font size of the last child by setting the font size property to 35 pixels. And we can also take it even one step further by combining pseudo elements with pseudo classes. Let's create a pseudo element for the last child of the list, and let's use the content property to display a heart emoji. And if we want to create stylings for the first list item, we can use the first child pseudo class. Let's change the color of the first list item to dark orange, and if we want to target a specific element which is not first or last child, we can use the nth child pseudo class. The nth child pseudo class is a function with one argument, the index of the element we want to style. So we want to target the second list item, so we pass the number 2. And we want to change the color to sky blue. We can do even more crazy stuff by targeting only the first letter. The first letter pseudo element is used for that. So we write P : because it's a pseudo element and not a pseudo class, and then first letter. Let's make the first letter really huge by setting the font size to 30 pixels. Next, let's create a really long text which wraps to multiple lines, because I want to show you that we can even target a specific line of a text. For example, we could make the first line of the text bold by using the first line pseudo element. So we write P : first line, and then we set the font weight to bold. And finally, we will have a look at the most commonly used pseudo class, in my opinion, the so-called hover pseudo class. The hover pseudo class is used to create cool mouse over effects. So when we hover over an element with our mouse, we could change the background color, for example. Let's change the background color of our list container to green when we hover over it. And take a look at the browser. As soon as the mouse is over the element, the background turns to green. Congratulations! Now you know all of the basics of HTML and CSS. And now it's time to use your knowledge to build your first real-world website, a portfolio website, which you can use to show off your work and your skills. And you can download the code on GitHub to extend the portfolio website as much as you want. So let's start and dive into the code. And we start off with a simple HTML page. And I already have added some meta tags for the description and linked a style sheet and added a title for the home page. Now we start adding some content to the page, and in the body of the page we add first a header element, and the header element will be displayed on top of our page. It consists of a H1 element and a navigation menu, and the navigation menu contains the list with all of the links to different pages of our website. The first entry of the navigation menu is the link to the home page, the second to an about page, the third one to the portfolio page, and another one for the blog of our website. Then we will link a contact form, and finally the resume or CV. Now let's start writing our first CSS code, and we will start off by defining some simple variables. The first variable is for the primary color, and then we need a secondary color and an accent color as well. A background color, of course, which is the color of the background for the whole page. Then we need a font color for the text of our website, a secondary font color for special text, and a variable for the border radius. Now we will write our first stylings, and we start off with the header element. We set the background color to the primary color variable, and then we set the color to the font color variable. The header should be a flex container, so we set the display property to flex and the height to 70 pixels. Then we want, of course, our elements to be aligned in the center, so we set align item center and justify content space between, so our navigation menu is displayed to the right. Next we're going to add stylings to the navigation menu, and first we disable the bullet points by setting list style to none. Then we make the navigation menu flex, and now we style the list items, giving it a margin of 0 and 15 pixels, and the header a padding of 0 and 20 pixels, and also setting the width of the header to 100%. Next we are going to style the links inside of the list items. First we set the color to the font color and the text decoration to none, so we remove the underline, and we make it a little bit more bold, so we set font weight to 400 and give it a little bit padding, 10 pixels vertically and 15 pixels horizontally, and also we want to make it a little bit rounded, so we set the border radius to our border radius variable and give it a transition to make it appear smooth when we hover over it, so we set the transition property to our transition variable. And now we want to add a hover effect, so we set the background color to the accent color when we hover over the button and the color to white. Now we want to style the body. We want to change the font family globally to Verdana, and we are setting the line height globally to 1.6, and also the global color will be font color secondary. Now we are styling the heading, and we make it a little bit bolder by setting font weight to 600, font size to 25 pixels, and the color should be the accent color. Okay, nice. So now we have finished the header of our page, and next we are going to create some actual content elements for our homepage. And on the homepage, we want to show a so-called hero section. So we create a section element and give it the class content and hero. Inside of it, we create an H2 heading, a text paragraph, and a link which will lead to our portfolio site. And the link is going to have the class BTN, which stands for button, and the label view my work. Now we are going to style it with CSS. So we write CSS for the .hero selector, and first we are going to set the height to 100 vertical height minus 70 pixels, which is the height of the header. So the hero section will take up the full height of the browser window minus the height of the header. Next, we are going to set the background of the hero section. For that, we copy and paste an image which serves as the background of our hero section. And then we create a background as follows with a linear gradient and the hero background.png image as background. As you can see in the browser, now we have a background consisting of the image with a light overlay gray color. And now we continue by setting the color to the font color, aligning the text in the center, making it flex, setting align items and justify content to center, and the flex direction to column, and giving it a little bit of padding, let's say 20 pixels. We want to increase the font size of the H2 heading. Give it also a little bit of margin bottom of 20 pixels and make it appear a little bit more bold by setting the font weight to 600. And the text paragraph, we want to give a font size of 20 pixels and limiting the max width to 600 pixels and also margin bottom and a font weight of 300 to make it appear a little bit light. Now we're going to style our link, and so we write some CSS for the .btn selector. We set the background color to our accent color, the font color to white, a little bit of padding, and we set the text decoration to none, so the underline will disappear, and we want it a little bit rounded, so we set the border radius. Now take a look at the browser. If we hover over the View My Work button, we have the cool hover effect. Next, we're going to declare two more variables, one for the box shadow, which we have already used, but not defined yet, and the second one for the transition, which we have also used in some stylings already, but haven't defined it yet. So let's head to the button selector again and give it a little box shadow by setting the box shadow variable we have just defined. And also let's set the transition to make the hover effect smooth. Take a look at the browser, and as we hover over the button, it appears very smooth now. I think we should open our page in a full screen browser for the first time now to really see what we have built so far. In my opinion, it already looks very cool. The body of our website should be a grid, so we set display to grid, and then we define the grid template rows. We want to have one row of 5 fractions and another row of 1 fraction, and the columns should be 100%, and the grid should have a min height of 100 VH. The 5 fraction row will be our content area, and the 1 fraction row will be the footer of the page. Now you might be wondering why we don't use 3 rows, because we also have the header. That's because we will make the header fixed, and that means it will be removed from the normal document flow, so it's also not part of the grid. Next, we're going to make the footer of our page, so we use the footer element, and we add a text paragraph with a copyright notice and the navigation menu linking to some social media pages of yourself. Now we have to style the footer using CSS, so we use the footer selector, and first we set the background color to our primary color, similar to the header, and the text color to our font color, and we want to align the text in the center. Next, we give it a vertical padding of 20 pixels and an horizontal padding of 0 and a bit more of top padding, so we set padding top to 40 pixels. Next, we're going to style the text paragraph of the footer. First, we give it a margin bottom of 10 pixels and we're setting the font size to 14 pixels. Now it's time to style the navigation menu of the footer. So first we disable the list style by setting list style to none. Then we make it flex, and justify content we set to center, and we give it a margin top of 10 pixels. And finally, we want to add some spacing between the list items. So we set some margin of 0 pixel vertically and 15 pixels horizontally. The links of our navigation menu need some makeover as well. So let's set the color to the font color and the text decoration to none to remove the underline. Also, let's set the font weight to 600 and give it a transition, so when we hover over it, we'll get a smooth effect. On hover, we want the color to change to our accent color, and we want to set the text decoration to underline again. I've already mentioned that we want to make our header fixed, so we set the position property to fixed, and we want to make it display on the top of the page, so we set top to 0. We set the Z index to 1000 and give it a box shadow. So now the header will be always displayed on top of the page, even when we are scrolling. Nice, now we have finished our home page and it's time for creating our second page. We want to add an about page, so let's create the file about.html and copy and paste all of the contents from our index.html to the about.html file. Now we have to make some changes to the HTML. First we change the title to about me and remove all the content area from the index.html HTML file. The About page will have a simple section which you can use to tell a little bit about yourself. So let's create a section element and set the two classes Content and About. And next we're adding an H2 heading and two text paragraphs. And of course, we want to style the About section by using CSS. Let's first set a padding of 120 pixels to the top, and then 0 pixels, 60 pixels, and 0 again. Then we want to align the text in the center. Okay, we forgot to do it. Let's set the min width of the H1 heading in the header to 190 pixels. So it's not wrapping into two lines. Back to the About section again, and let's add some stylings for the H2 heading. First, we're going to set a margin bottom of 30 pixels. Then we set the font size to 25 pixels. And finally, the color to the primary color. The text paragraph of the About section should get a max width of 700 pixels. And let's also set the font size to 20 pixels and the line height to 1.8. Let's take a first look on our About page in the browser, and as we will see, it's not really centered yet. That's what we're gonna do next. So let's write margin 0 auto to center the text paragraph. And as you can see now, our About section is correctly centered. We have completed the About section, so it's time to create a new file, portfolio.html, and we will copy and paste the contents of the About page to our newly created portfolio page. Let's change the title to portfolio, and of course we will also change the heading About Me to Portfolio and the class About to Portfolio as well. Let's remove the two text paragraphs because now we want to create some content for our portfolio. We want our portfolio page to be a grid, so we create a div container and giving it the class Portfolio Grid. Inside of the div container, we create another div container for the portfolio item, and each portfolio item consists of an image and a text paragraph describing the portfolio item. Now we have to copy and paste the image files for our portfolio items. So I have prepared two images, project 1 PNG and project 2 PNG, and we will paste it to our source directory. Now take a look at the browser. The image is displayed very large, and we are going to change that by using CSS. But first we want to write the CSS code for the portfolio container, and the first thing we define is some padding of 60 pixels vertically and 0 pixels horizontally. Then we are going to align the text to the center, and we are setting the background color to our background color variable. Next, we create some styles for the H2 heading of the portfolio. First, we want a margin bottom of 30 pixels, and then we're going to set the font size to 35 pixels and the color to our primary color. And now it's time to define the grid for our portfolio. First, we set the display property to grid, and then we limit the max width of the image of the portfolio item to 100%, so it doesn't exceed the dimensions of the portfolio item container. Let's set the height to auto and give it a border radius by assigning our border radius variable. And also a margin bottom of 15 pixels. The portfolio item should have a padding of 20 pixels on all sides, and it should be also rounded, so we set a border radius and a box shadow by applying our two variables. And the same goes for the transition. So far we have only set the display property to grid, but haven't defined any columns or rows yet. That's what we're going to do now. So we use the grid template columns property and the repeat function to create a dynamic amount of columns by using the autofit value, and those columns should be between 300 pixels and 500 pixels wide. Let's set justify content to center and give the grid items a gap of 30 pixels. A portfolio with a single item is very boring. That's why we are going to add a second one now. Let's take a look at our portfolio page in the browser now. And as you can see, it looks very cool. Next, we're going to create a cool hover effect for our portfolio items. But this time we won't change the color, but instead transform the item by -5 pixels on the y-axis. Take a look. As soon as we hover over one of our portfolio items, they move a little bit up. Next, we're going to take care of our blog page. So we create another HTML file again, and we call it blog.html. And again, we copy and paste the content of our previous page to the blog page. And now we have to change some things, for example, the title to blog and the H2 heading to blog as well, and the class of the section, and remove the content of the portfolio page. We create a div container with the class blog role, which will serve as the main container for our blog posts. And inside the blog role container, we create different article elements. Let's start creating one and give it the class blog post. Inside each of the article elements, we add an H3 heading, which is the title of the blog post, a text paragraph for the date on which the article was published, another text paragraph which describes the content of the post, and finally a read more link. And now we are going to write the CSS code for our blog page. First we want to give a padding of 60 pixels vertically and 0 pixels horizontally for the whole blog container. And also we are going to set the background color to secondary color and the text color to our font color. Next, it's the H2 heading's turn, and we're going to apply some stylings to it. First, we start by setting a margin bottom of 30 pixels and a font size of 25 pixels. Then we want the color to be our accent color and to align it center by using the text align property. Next, we style the blog role container, and the first thing we're going to do is limiting the maximum width to 1000 pixels, and then we set the margin to 0 auto to align it in the center. And for the single blog post, we set the background color to our primary color variable, the padding to 25 pixels. We are going to give a margin bottom of 30 pixels and apply our border radius variable, as well as our box shadow variable and the transition variable. Next, we are going to create the same hover effect as for the portfolio items. So when we hover a blog post, we want to move it up by 5 pixels. So we use the transform property for that and the translate Y function. And also we want to set the cursor to pointer. So our cursor changes when we hover over a blog post. The H3 heading of the blog post will get a margin bottom of 15 pixels. We set the font size to 18 pixels and the color to our accent color variable. Next up are the text paragraphs of the blog post. They will get a margin bottom of 10 pixels and a smaller font size of 15 pixels. And the last thing we're going to style is the read more link. First we set the color to the accent color and we remove the text decoration. And we want to make the font weight bold. And finally decrease the font size to 14 pixels. Let's take a look at our blog page now. In my opinion, it looks really cool. Look at all those fancy colors and beautiful stylings. Next we're going to create the contact form, which your website visitors can use to get in contact with you. So we're doing the same thing like before. We create a new HTML page, contact.html, and we copy all the contents of our previous HTML page to the new one. And now, of course, we have to change some things, for example, the title and the H2 heading. Do you remember, to create a form, we have to use the form element. And inside the form, we create a div container, which will contain our first input element, and a label to describe which input element it is. So the first input element we want to create is for the name of the user, and the name input is of type text. And we also set the ID attribute to name and the name attribute as well. We want the name field to be mandatory, so we set the required attribute. After setting the basic HTML of our form, it's time to write the CSS code. Let's start with the container of the contact form by setting a padding of 100 pixels vertically and 0 pixels horizontally, aligning the text center, making it display flex, and setting the flex direction to column, and also setting align items to center. The H2 heading of the page will get some stylings next. So first we set the margin bottom of 30 pixels, then we set the font size to 25 pixels, and the color of the text to our primary color variable. And next we're going to style the labels in our form. We want to make our labels flex, so we set the display property to flex. We want to give it a margin bottom of 10 pixels and setting the font size to 16 pixels. The input elements will also get some stylings. So we write a selector consisting of form input, comma, form text area, because we want the stylings to apply for both. And we want to set the width to 100%, the padding to 15 pixels, and a solid border of 1 pixel. Let's make the labels bold to make them more readable. And let's increase the font size to 20 pixels. The same we will do for the input itself. We set the font size to 20 pixels, so when we type text into it, it appears at a reasonable size. It's time to add the second form field for the email address of the user. And let's make the form flex and set the flex direction to column and give it a gap of 20 pixels to have a bit of space between each of the form fields. The third input field of the form will be a text area for the message which the user wants to send to us. And then finally we add a button for submitting the form. The text area we have already styled before, so let's style the button. First we set the background color to our accent color, the font color to white, give it a little bit of padding, remove the border which buttons have by default, default and add a border radius, so now the button looks cool. And also we want to change the cursor to pointer and apply our transition variable. Let's increase the font size to 20 pixels. And that's it. But now we want to create a hover effect for the button as well. So we want the background color to change to our secondary color. Let's take a look at the form in the browser, and as you can see we have 3 input fields. But the form isn't working right now. That's because we need some kind of backend server where we can send the data of our form to. We will learn everything about sending form data to a server and processing it in a different course of this channel. So we have finished the form. And it's time to create the last page of our portfolio website. And this page is called resume.html. And as always, we copy and paste the contents of the previous HTML page to our newly created one and change up some things like the title of the page and the H2 heading. The H2 heading we will change to resume/CV. The first content element we are adding is a link in a paragraph element. And this link points to our resume file, which can be downloaded as PDF. And now let's head to the CSS. First, we are going to add some padding as always, 100 pixels vertically and 0 pixels horizontally. Then we center the text by using the text align property and setting the background color to the global background color variable. Then we are going to take care of the H2 heading. We set the margin bottom to 30 pixels and the font size to 25 pixels. The color we set to the primary color variable. And now we're going to add a div container and give it the class resume grid, because we are going to add another grid for the resume page, which contains all the different resume sections. Let's create the first one by creating a div container and giving it the class resume section. It should contain an H3 heading, experience, and 2 text paragraphs listing your different experiences you have in web development. Let's add a second one for listing all of your skills. This time it contains an unordered list. Take a look at the browser. The sections aren't looking very structured, and we are going to change that by using CSS. First, we set up the grid, so we set the display property to grid. And then we use grid template columns again and use the same value we have used for our portfolio page. So we want to have grid columns between 300 pixels and 500 pixels wide. Let's open it in the browser, and as you can see, the 3 columns are already displayed, but not looking very well yet. So first, let's center the content of the grid by setting justify content to center and add a gap between the columns. And also a margin top of 40 pixels to increase the spacing between the heading and the grid. Next, let's style the resume section. And first we set the background color to white, then we give it a padding of 20 pixels and a border radius by applying our border radius variable, and the box shadow by applying our box shadow variable. And finally we set list style type to none. And that's it! It's time to celebrate! You have successfully created your first real website from scratch. The next topic you should start learning now is JavaScript, which I cover on Learndev as well. So make sure to subscribe to the channel to not miss any content about learning to code. And if you like this full course video, please make sure to like it and share it with your friends. So have a great day, happy learning, and see you in the next one. Bye!